Good morning. The beloved community should be a chatty community, and you are, and we're glad that you are. We welcome you this morning to the second lecture. I feel bad calling them lectures because they're really not like lectures. They're more like cheerleading, but we'll call it a lecture for this group because we're really academic. But we're very delighted that each of you are here, and we're glad for your participation in this very important conversation about justice and about the voice of faith in the cry for those who are seeking to pursue justice in the world. And so we're delighted that you are here. Just so we know, and so Dr. Rah will know, how many of you were able to be here last night? I know it was kind of a closed group, so it looks like maybe about a third to a quarter were here last night. So the rest of you, you're in for a treat. We're glad that you are able to be here with us today. Just a very brief word about Dr. Rah, because I want to save him as much time as possible to talk to you and to listen to you. And then we will move on to other events for the day. Dr. Rah is the professor for church growth and evangelism at North Park University in Chicago, Illinois. He has a number of degrees, a BA degree in political science and history and sociology from Columbia University, a DMin and an MDiv from Gordon Conwell School of Theology, and also a THM from Harvard University. So he comes to us well prepared and well experienced in dealing with the world of academia. He is an adept social scientist, an insightful and inspired theologian, a skilled author. He has authored most recently 3 books, Many Colors, Cultural Intelligence for a Changing Church, The Next Evangelism, Releasing the Church from Western Cultural Captivity, and Mercy and Justice, Growing Healthy Asian American Churches. In addition, he is a passionate activist for justice, and as you will find out in just a few moments, if you've not already heard him, he is an engaging lecturer who will invite our best thoughts and considerations in the topics that he will present. At the conclusion of his lecture today, he will offer time for question and answer, response. We'll save about 10 minutes for that. It will be near the end of the hour, about 10:45, and so those of you who have classes to go to, you'll be able to excuse yourself at that point. We will make sure that we close the lecture before 10:45, so everyone will have plenty of time to get to their classes. At the conclusion of the lecture, I'm going to ask our good friend Clifford Little, pastor of Greens Tabernacle Baptist Church, to come and give our benediction. But if you would now, bow with me please for a word of blessing on this time. O God, who so loves the world, forgive us for not loving it along with you, for not loving those who are our neighbors, those who are neighbors who look differently than us, who think differently than us, who act differently than us. Help us to gather within our own vision your love for the world, for all the beauty and diversity and dimension of every human being and all of creation. Open our ears this morning that we might hear what Dr. Rah has to say to us and what we believe that you would even dare to say to us. And open our hearts to receive it gladly and deeply. And open our hands then to do what we have heard. For all of this we ask in your good name. Amen. Dr. Rah, we welcome you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those of you who were here last night coming back. Thank you for those who are here for the first time. I'm going to talk today about a theology of reconciliation, a theology of racial justice and racial reconciliation. The reason I'm doing that is because this community, the beloved community that is forming through Mercer and through the community around us, is intentionally trying to be a religious, spiritual, maybe even intentionally Christian community. And as Christians, one of the primary tenets of our work of justice, mercy, compassion, these important values, is that they come from a text. They come from our text, the sacred text, our scriptures, the Bible. So whenever I think about the work of the church, and I think about sometimes the witness of the church in the world, oftentimes what's out there in the world is not a biblical Christianity. It is a sociological, maybe even a politicized Christianity. And so as Christians, one of the things we want to get back to is that our motivation for our actions, our motivation for justice, our motivation for compassion, mercy, these motivations have to come from our text, our scriptures. And so that's why I want us to point us towards the theology and practice of lament that we find in our scriptures, particularly out of the book of Lamentations. We discussed yesterday that the context of the story in the book of Lamentations comes from a place where Israel and Jerusalem had fallen, and they were tempted to run away and hide from the problems that are found in the world. And God, through the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 29, says that's not an option for you. So that first option you see of running away and hiding when the world around us changes, that is not an option for us as Christians. The option then, or the option that I think we need to embrace, is what's there in the third option at the bottom, which is the practice of lament as a way of engaging injustice in the world. The practice of lament and the practice of lament as a Christian community in order for us to engage the problem of injustice in the world. So I want to give you two things. One is about the authorship of the book of Lamentation and why that's important for us. And the second is to examine one of the key aspects of the genre of the book of Lamentations and how that also speaks to our reconciliation efforts. Let's talk first about the authorship of the book of Lamentations. I mentioned yesterday that the book of Lamentations is written in the context of the exile. Jerusalem has fallen, Israel has fallen, the people of God no longer have their promised land. Those who conquered Jerusalem and Israel was the nation, city-state of Babylon. And Babylon, the Babylonians were brutal conquerors. One of the things they would do is they would go to a city that they conquered, take all the able-bodied men, those who could read or write, those who were the prophets, the priests, and the kings of that community, and take them out and send them away into exile, and leave behind the widows, the orphans, the sick, the lame, and the blind. Anybody that they deemed would not be able to rebuild Jerusalem or Israel's society, they would allow them to stay, but anybody who they thought could rebuild that society, the literate, the leaders, etc., they were taken away into exile. That, of course, for many of us familiar with the scripture, know that that's how the story of Daniel and his friends come about. These were young men who were potentially leaders. They took them away and sent them away into exile into Babylon, so that those who were left in Jerusalem were, again, the widows, the orphans, the sick, the lame, the crippled, and the blind, those who they deemed as unable to rebuild that society. So the number of people who could write a book like Lamentations, and Lamentations was clearly written in the city of Jerusalem after the exile, the number of candidates who could write the book of Lamentations is almost non-existent. Because like I said, the literate, the trained writers, the prophets would all have been sent away into exile. And so there are very few, if any, candidates who could actually write a book like Lamentations. If you read the writing of Lamentations, it's actually fairly sophisticated. It actually has poetic elements to it that show whoever wrote this is a literate person. But there is one candidate who actually could have written the book of Lamentations, and historically the church has credited this person with writing the book of Lamentation, and that, of course, is the prophet Jeremiah. We encounter Jeremiah in his own writings talking about weeping and lamenting, so we know that that's a part of his style of writing or his thinking process about weeping and lamenting. And again, he might be the only person left in Jerusalem who could read or write and who would have the intellectual capacity and the skills to write a book like Lamentations. So for a long time, historically, traditionally, we have credited the prophet Jeremiah with the writing of the book Lamentations, until we do a little bit deeper dive into the writing style. If you read the book of Jeremiah in its original Hebrew, and if you read the book of Lamentation in its original Hebrew, it's very clear as you're reading these two works that this is not by the same author. The styles are too different. The contrasting elements, there are too many dissimilarities between the book of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations to say this is the same author. The way I've illustrated it is to say, if you read Shakespeare and then you read Tupac, in all probability, they are not the same person. Now, they're both great poets. They both have great poetry. Their styles of writing are just a little bit different. So Shakespeare and Tupac are probably not the same people because their approach to writing is different. It's almost as sharp a contrast we see between Jeremiah and Lamentations. The style of writing is so markedly different that it's hard to tell that it's the same author. It probably is not the same author. So what is our explanation of who wrote the book of Lamentations? In all probability, Jeremiah is the only one left in Jerusalem who could read or write, but the style of writing that he does in Lamentations is way too different from what happens in the book of Jeremiah. So what's the answer? Well, the answer, it turns out, is that Jeremiah wrote down the words as maybe the only literate person in society at the time. He wrote them down, but they're not his words. They're other people's words. This is what's beautiful about the book of Lamentations. After the fall of Jerusalem, after the suffering and the devastation of that city, Jeremiah, the only prophet left in Jerusalem, goes to the city gate. That would be the town center. And those who have suffered, the women, the children, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, they would come out to the town center and they would begin to tell their stories. They would talk about how much they've suffered. They would talk about the pain that they endured. And Jeremiah the prophet would be there writing down not his story, but other people's stories. Not the story of the privileged, educated prophet. That person, the privileged, educated prophet, gets out of the way so that the hurting, the sick, the lame, the blind, the crippled, the widows, and the orphans, their stories can be heard. It's one of the most powerful illustrations in the book of Lamentations, that sometimes when we do the work of justice, we might bring to the front and centered the privileged and educated voices. Those voices who have authority because they have credentials. Those voices that are powerful because they have power, because we want the powerful and the privileged to speak. But what we see in the book of Lamentation as an authentic lament and an authentic cry to God is not the powerful and the privileged speaking out, but it is the marginalized, the oppressed, and the sick and the hurting whose voices are brought front and centered. And I would say if there is a work of justice that we need to engage in our society, is that maybe we tell the voices with power to just kind of shut up for a little while, to stop tweeting for just a little while, for the voices with all that power to not speak just for a little while, because what we really need to hear for true justice to be spoken and heard is the marginalized, the voiceless. Those who have been previously powerless. That's the example we see in Scripture. The powerful person, Jeremiah, the educated person, the privileged person, Jeremiah, gets out of the way so that those without privilege, those without power, their voices can be heard. This is an important part of our pursuit of racial justice and justice in our society. I want to ask the question, if we elevate the privileged voices, whose perspective dominates the conversation? Whose perspective, whose point of view, whose gaze dominates the conversation? One of the main problems in our conversation on racial justice is that the privileged often dictate the terms. And what happens around the racial conversation and dialogue is often set by the privileged and the powerful, and not by those who've been hurt most by racial injustice in our world. So again, the question is, whose perspective are we bringing to the front and center? If we take the example of Lamentations, it has to be the voice of the marginalized rather than the voice of the privileged. So I'll illustrate it in this way, that when we talk about the perspective that dominates our conversation, especially around race, I would argue that in this quadrilateral of relationship, it's much more complex than this, but I want to point out these four categories here. When the white male and the black male and the white female and the black female interact. Now, I'm leaving out Asians, I'm leaving out all sorts of different categories, but let's focus on these 4 primary categories. In this relationship, whose point of view, whose perspective determines how we understand another person's perspective? My argument is that in our society, the gaze and perspective of the white male dominates how others are viewed, and that hinders our conversation because it centralizes the privileged voice rather than the marginalized voice. So, when the white male looks upon the black male, how the white male views the black male is determinative for how all of society views the black male. And the 2 categories that I've put up here is that when the white male views the black male, the white male sees the black male as one of 2 categories, the pet and a threat. The pet category are black men who are entertainers, black men who are athletes, hip-hop artists, musicians, comedians. But the white male's gaze wants the black male to stay in the pet category. So if you are an athlete, and even if you've taken your team to the Super Bowl, and you have a great record as a quarterback, the second you take a knee, you've moved from being a pet to a threat, and you must be eliminated. Comedians, one of the great prophets of our generation, Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle is a comedic genius. He had a hit show on Comedy Central for many years. He was given like a $40 million contract for one more season of his hit show, The Chappelle Show. Anybody know what he did? He walked away, turned it down flat, left Hollywood altogether and said, I don't want to have anything to do with it. What was his rationale? His rationale is, you are seeing me as a threat, so you're trying to make me more into your pet. What Chappelle noted was that every strong black male comedian in Hollywood, at one point or another in their career, appears in drag. Whether it's Eddie Murphy, Jamie Foxx, Tyler Perry, Martin Lawrence, strong black men who are comedians, they move from the category into threat. They yank them back into the pet territory by presenting them not as strong men, but as dressed in drag. And Chappelle said, this is you seeing me as a threat and wanting to keep me as a pet. And so Chappelle walked away from $40 million contract to say, you're not going to do that. Now, think about this with me, of how the gaze of the white male determines what happens to that black male in society. What is, according to the 6 o'clock news, the greatest threat to your local neighborhood and city? The greatest threat to your local neighborhood and city is the unidentified black male. Because according to the 6 o'clock news, every crime in your neighborhood has been committed by the unidentified black male. Today on the south side of Chicago, there was a drive-by shooting by an unidentified black male. Today at a local liquor store, it was knocked over by an unidentified black male. There was a stabbing at a local school by an unidentified black male. This unidentified black male is approximately 15 to 40 years old, approximately 5'7" or 6'8" tall, weighs anywhere from 150 to 300 pounds. If you have seen such a black male, you must identify him immediately and report him to the police, because he is a threat to our community. And that's why a 12-year-old boy playing in a park like any 12-year-old boy would be doing, because he's an unidentified black male, even though he is 12 years old. Let me say that again. He is a 12-year-old boy playing in a local park. Within a split second of the police arriving, he is shot dead, because he is an unidentified black male, and automatically that puts you into the threat category. The language around so many of our police shootings against black men in particular is that these are beasts. That was the language that was used about Michael Brown. He was a beast. He was a Hulk. So no matter how old you are, no matter what size you are, no matter what even socioeconomic category you You could be a frail old man running away and you will be shot in the back because you are an unidentified black male. By virtue of your blackness and your maleness in society, you have automatically become a threat to that society. Whose gaze, whose perspective determines one's status in society? It's the dominant culture of the white male. Now, one more category to this. When the black male looks at the white female, what happens to the black male? What has history taught us about when a black male looks at the white female? It's a person by the name of Emmett Till, who was a young boy from Chicago, also a young teenager, who was accused of looking at the white female, and by looking at the black female, he was deemed automatically a threat to that white female. And what happened to him? He was killed. He was lynched. He was brutalized because he was a black male looking at a white female, and that became a threat to the white male. And that's why when a presidential candidate opens his campaign with the accusation that Mexicans are what? Mexicans are rapists, he is tapping into this perspective that the person of color, particularly the male of color, is a sexual threat to the white female. And so that phrase, if you know some of the history behind it, that was not in the original speech written for Donald Trump. He inserted that himself in the course of giving that speech, intentionally pointing out that a person of color, whether it's a black male or a Mexican male or an Asian male or any person of an Arabic male, their main threat is towards white women. And therefore, they are the ultimate threat. Mexicans are rapists, therefore, we cannot let them into our country. Whose perspective, whose gaze determines how one stands in American society? This is why it's so important that when we have these conversations on race, when we have these dialogues on race, we must hear not just the voice of the privileged, not just from the prophet who is learned and educated, but we must hear from all of the voices in the conversation. You must hear from the voices that had been previously marginalized, the voices that have been silenced in the past. These are the voices we must hear. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament professor for many, many years, now retired, writes about the theology of shalom. Shalom is a biblical word, an Old Testament Hebrew word that actually is oftentimes mistranslated in our Bibles. You'll see the word peace in many of our Bibles that translates the Hebrew word shalom. That's an inaccurate translation. It's a Western version of a non-Western concept. The concept of shalom in the Hebrew text is this concept not of the absence of war, which is the way we understand peace. Peace in the Western vernacular means the absence of war. Shalom in the Hebrew does not mean simply the absence of war, it means the fullness of God. It means the completeness, the full measure, the full completion of who God is. So it's not the absence of something, it is the presence or the fullness of something. So Brueggemann points out that if we are to engage in justice work, we are not simply trying to do away with injustice, we are trying to magnify the fullness of the justice of God. Do you see the difference? See, peace in the English means we have the absence of war. Peace/shalom in the Hebrew is not simply the absence of war, it is the presence and the fullness of God. And so racial reconciliation is not simply getting rid of all that bad stuff, it is bringing together the good stuff as well. It is not simply lessening tensions, it is amplifying the goodness in that beloved community. That's the biblical, theological, Hebrew idea of shalom. Now, the way Brueggemann looks at this then is to say, if we really want to be a shalom people, a shalom community, a beloved shalom community, we not only have to hear from the haves, but we must also hear from the have-nots. He makes this illustration, that the haves in our society, the privileged, the powerful, operate under the theology of celebration. That's what you see in the left-hand column. The have-nots in our society operate under the theology of suffering. That's what you see on the right-hand column. The left-hand column, for those who are the haves, living under celebration, means they have good resources and they want to keep, manage, and steward those resources. For those who are the haves, life is already pretty good, so they don't want to keep the good things in their life. God is oftentimes pictured as a maternal, generous, maternal figure. Those who are the haves want things to stay the same because they like the status quo and the things staying the same. Those who are the have-nots have a different way of looking at the world. They're living to survive day to day because they don't have the material goods. Life is precarious. They're constantly looking for a deliverer. This, by the way, is the difference in some of the Psalms. Sometimes the Psalms will say, I will bring the chicks to me like a mother hen. That's celebration. And others it says, Lord, come and break the teeth of my enemy. That's suffering. You see the difference even within the Psalms of a God who nurtures and cares for his people versus a God who needs to come and destroy the enemy of the broken and the lost and the suffering. And so the suffering have-nots are fighting injustice rather than striving to maintain the status quo. Let me illustrate it in this way. Think of the richest neighborhood in Macon, Mercer University. Okay, so think of the richest neighborhood, in this community. We're going to sneak in. It's a gated community. We're going to somehow we're going to get into that community. We're going to look for the biggest house in the richest community around. And we go to this huge house and we knock on the door and a 16-year-old girl answers the door. And we say, we're taking a survey of this neighborhood of what do you think heaven is going to be like. And so that 16-year-old answers, oh, heaven is going to be so awesome. Heaven's going to be fantastic. Because here on earth, my parents bought me a Dell desktop from Sam's Club. But when I get to heaven, I'm getting a Mac Airbook. That's what I'm getting in heaven. Here on earth, I have a tiny little TV on my desk. But when I get to heaven, I'm getting a 75-inch plasma with surround sound and full satellite hookup. Here on earth, for my 16th birthday, my parents got me a Toyota Yaris, a Ford little dinky car. When I get to heaven, I'm getting a Lamborghini. I'm getting a Porsche. Now, for that 16-year-old who's living in relative comfort, who's living in the midst of affluence and celebration, heaven is going to be more of what she has on earth. Why? Because she already has good things on earth. So her picture of heaven is going to be, it's just going to be a lot more of all these wonderful things I already have. We take that same question, we go to a refugee camp in Lebanon, or we go to during the time of the Sudanese Civil War to Darfur. We go to Haiti after the earthquake. We go to Nepal after the earthquake. We go to Southeast Asia after the tsunami. We go to these places where they are very much the have-nots. And if we ask that very same question just to a different 16-year-old girl in a different set of circumstances, I guarantee you we will get a different set of answers. We ask a 16-year-old in a refugee camp in Lebanon and say, what do you think heaven's going to be like? She's not going to say all the things I have on earth, just better versions of it. She's going to say, heaven is nothing like the world I'm living in right now. Heaven is a place where food and water are actually nearby. I don't have to walk miles to get clean water. Heaven is a place where my parents have not been killed by rebel warriors, and I still have my parents. Heaven is a place where I'm not worried about getting raped every night of my life because of the conditions here in this refugee camp. Heaven is nothing like the world I'm living in right now. Now, what we've done in terms of justice, because we've privileged the privileged voice, what we've done in work of justice is to say the work of justice is that 16-year-old in the rich community in the United States going to that poor community in somewhere else and dumping their money and maybe in a shoebox or something, dumping their money and their resources into that poor community and then running back to our gated community in our homes. That's been our idea of justice. To dump our resources to say that's how we fix the world's problems. By writing a check, by filling a shoebox with toys that we don't want anymore to send to those poor kids in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. We have thought that justice is the haves dumping their excess resources on the have-nots. But if we really want a complete picture of heaven, you better hear both of those voices. Because you don't get a complete picture of heaven if you only hear one side of the story. Because heaven will be many of the good things on earth that we will see in heaven, but heaven will be nothing like what we see here on earth as well. And in order to get the shalom picture of heaven, you need the voice of the 16-year-old here in the United States, but you also must hear the voice of the 16-year-old in refugee camps and in the places where there is great suffering and sorrow. That is where our theology becomes complete. And that's why when we talk about race and racial reconciliation, we must hear the voices that have been previously marginalized. I'll give you an example of this. My doctoral dissertation was on black evangelicals, African-American evangelicals in the 1960s and 1970s. And there was a particular evangelical who was very prominent in the 60s and 70s. His name was Tom Skinner. Tom Skinner was a phenomenal evangelist. But his background is really interesting. He grew up in Harlem. He grew up in the church, but he led a double life. So at school, he was the good kid, president of his Shakespeare club, on the fencing team, on the football team, straight-A student, class president. He was doing everything well in school, but outside of school, he was a leader of the Harlem Lords, one of the toughest street gangs in New York City at the time. He was leading this double life, good kid in school, good kid at church, but then on the streets, he was the gang leader of the Harlem Lords. Now, he was about to lead his gang into this huge turf battle. Now, if his gang won that turf battle, Tom Skinner would become the undisputed gang leader of New York because of him organizing that gang. So he's kind of psyching himself up. He's a teenager psyching himself up for this gang fight. He's listening to a radio station, and they interrupt the regular music program with a gospel radio show. It's a radio evangelist preaching the gospel as he was getting ready for a gang fight. Somehow or another, that gospel message gets to the heart of Tom Skinner, and he says, I'm going to be a follower of Jesus. And in fact, he goes to the gang that very night and says, the fight is off. I'm no longer the leader of this gang. I have to walk away. Later, his friends would say, we wanted to kill you. We were ready to kill you. Something supernaturally held us back from killing you on the spot. That's what we should have done when our gang leader tries to walk away. We couldn't do it. Something kept us from moving against you. From that moment on, Tom Skinner becomes one of the greatest evangelists of our generation. He goes to the streets of New York. He rents out the Apollo Theater in Harlem and speaks to thousands of people. He has crusades all over. White evangelicals hear Tom Skinner and say, this is the person we want representing blacks in American society. So he starts going to these rallies that are led by white evangelicals, and he gets to speak at many of these evangelical rallies. And he's giving that wonderful message. I was a gang leader living a double life. I heard a wonderful radio gospel program, and now I'm an evangelist for the gospel of Jesus Christ. White evangelicals loved that story. That was exactly what they wanted to hear. And he would go to all these different crusades and rallies. He even was part of the Billy Graham Association's gatherings. He was a classic American evangelical in the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, Christian colleges love Tom Skinner. He goes to Wheaton College. He speaks at missions conferences, Urbana. He goes to all these places where his message of being a bad kid who heard a radio gospel program and he became a Christian, that is told all throughout the world. But then after a certain point, when that stump speech kind of has run its course, he starts talking about race. He starts talking about racial injustice. And in 67, 68, and 69, he gave addresses at Wheaton that focused on his personal conversion. But in 69, he gives a talk that talks about social racial injustice. And in 1970, at a national mission conference, Urbana, about 20,000 people, he gives an address and he speaks about racial injustice. And all of a sudden, his voice gets silenced. He's asked not to come back to these Christian colleges. He's asked not to speak at mission conferences. Because the mission agent says, if you really put the focus on racial issues in America, it would take our energy away from justice issues or mission issues throughout the world. So we can't have you come speak at our mission conferences. Christian colleges will say, if you point out racial injustice, it will prevent our students from engaging the gospel of Jesus Christ about personal conversion because you're talking about social issues. My favorite piece of evidence was a letter. He had actually, as part of his evangelical cred, was actually asked to do a radio program on Moody Radio. And then they canceled him. I actually have the letter, or copy of the letter, that Moody sent him, and they said, "You are too political for Moody Radio." It's one of the most ironic letters ever written in history. It says, "You are too political for Moody Radio," because he was talking about race. He was being silenced. Now, what's interesting is that many years later, the revisionist history would say, well, it's because Tom Skinner got divorced. And back in the 70s, people don't know how to deal with divorce of their Christian leaders. That's why he was pushed out of evangelicalism, because by 1973, most white Christians had rejected Tom Skinner. He was not invited to speak at Christian conferences. He was not invited to speak at Christian colleges. He had been rejected by 1973. Everybody said, well, it's because you got divorced. We couldn't have you among our midst. I actually interviewed, Tom Skinner has passed, but I interviewed his brother, Johnny Skinner. And I asked him, so when did Tom get divorced? He said, 1978. So wait a minute, I was told that he was divorced 6 years earlier. That's why everybody rejected him. How do you know for sure that he got divorced in 78? He said, I served the papers to his wife. I should know exactly when Tom Skinner got divorced. And in fact, I talked to one of his key assistants. He said, even after he got divorced in 78, we kept it secret for a couple more years after that. So the public knowledge of his divorce was really not until the late 70s, early 1980s, that people knew that he had gotten divorced. But by 1973, 7 years earlier, he was already on the outs with many white evangelicals. So it was not because he got divorced, it was because he was beginning to speak on racial justice issues. My challenge to a community like this is, can you create the space where the marginalized voices speak up? Can you create a space, even if the conversation is difficult, even if the issues are difficult, we are beginning to have those difficult conversations because it is what is needed to move this forward a little further along. Are you willing to hear the voices that have been previously silenced? Because that is what leads to authentic lament. Let me do one more thing, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. I want to talk about the genre of the book of Lamentations. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and Chapter 4, and I'll put some of these things up here, are written in the style of what we call a funeral dirge. It's like a eulogy. In this case, in Lamentations, the death is of the city of Jerusalem. And so there is a necessity of the reality of the death of Jerusalem for there to be a funeral service. And so Lamentations is an appropriate response to the social reality of the death of the city of Jerusalem. Now, what's important here to note then is that a funeral lament or a funeral dirge is different from a hospital visit. Please notice the difference. If many pastors in this room, when you go to a hospital visit, I hope you have a different mindset than when you go to a funeral service. Right? When you do a hospital visit as a pastor, and I was a pastor for 17 years, you have the hope, even if the person is very, very sick, that person might get better. And you pray that with the family. You anoint with oil, you sing hymns, you pray together with the expectation, no matter how sick that person still is alive and could get better. And so a hospital visit must operate with different parameters. You do not do the same thing in a hospital visit that you do at a funeral. That doesn't make any sense. You don't go to a funeral as a pastor and they said, oh no, this person is not sick, let's all gather around and join hands and sing a couple of hymns and this person will feel a lot better. You don't do that at a funeral. You do that at a hospital visit, but not at a funeral. One of the problems with our conversation on race is that many people think racial reconciliation is a hospital visit when it's actually a funeral. A hospital visit, we sing a few songs, we join hands, sing kumbaya, say, I love you, man, hug it out. That's a hospital visit. That's not what we need, because we have dead bodies in the room when we talk about race. We have the dead bodies. Most of those dead bodies are of black, brown, red men and women. Most of those bodies are of black, brown, red men and women. And if we don't acknowledge the dead bodies in the room, we are just circling around the issues and not dealing with the reality of the situation. We're dealing with the dead bodies that were thrown overboard on the slave ships so that they were easy pickings for the sharks. There's well documented that slave ships would have schools of sharks following them because they knew an easy meal would be coming over. Those dead bodies are in our history. We have to deal with them. We have dead bodies on the plantation. We have dead bodies of sexually abused women on the plantation. We have dead bodies hanging as strange fruit from the trees in the South. And we have dead bodies of Michael Brown. We have dead bodies of Philando Castile. We have dead bodies of Alton Sterling. We have dead bodies of Sandra Bland. I've said those names, and I still haven't even scratched the surface of dead bodies in our history. We have to deal with the dead bodies. We don't simply go to that hospital visit where we join hands and do a sing-along. We've got to deal with that racial history. We've got to deal with the dead bodies in the room. Let me pause there and see if there's any Q&A. I know some of you might head to class. Feel free to slip out at any moment. I'm going to be here for the next 15 minutes, so those who can stay, and see if there's any kind of question, and we can have some discussion about some of the issues that I've raised here today. Thank you.
All right, well, you've done a terrific job. I've got a question then.
Thank you.
Is that all right if I ask a question? So one of the challenges, it seems to me, is that you're saying that when the people of privilege and power continue to be the ones who dominate the conversation, then the conversation always ends up in the same place and isn't helpful. And I've got a part two to that. But
okay, so that's a very important observation, because the word reconciliation has actually come under fire in more recent years, and some of that is kind of the semantics around that word. Because the word reconciliation, now there are multiple levels. One problem with the word reconciliation is that the times that it's used in Scripture, it usually refers to God being reconciled to humanity. Now, if we use that same metric when we talk about racial reconciliation, that can't apply, because it implies one group is superior to the other and offering graciousness to the lesser group. That's not the scenario. We're all equal, made in the image of God. So to use that language of reconciliation is problematic. The other part of it is, what are we being reconciled back to? You know, what's the previous existing relationship that we're going back to? And that's where, if the privileged dominate the dialogue, we're going back to a reconciled relationship, to a relationship that was kind of dysfunctional to begin with. So I'm going to point to another prophet, Eddie Murphy. Some of you remember Eddie Murphy's bit when he talked about the Come Back to Jamaica commercial. Y'all remember this? There was a very popular television commercial called Come Back to Jamaica. What's old is what's new. We want you to join us. We made it for you. And Eddie Murphy would say, I'm not going back to Jamaica. That's where slavery would happen. What's old is what's new. You're trying to bring back slavery. So the idea is that there are moments of history that, what are we going back to? Master-slave relationship? What are we going back to? The plantation? So to be reconciled to a previous relationship, that's problematic. Sometimes that's where the language is problematic. So that's what we talk about, is there a conciliation that needs to happen? And that might be more an appropriate language for those who have been marginalized from power, to say, we're not going to make America white again. We're not going back to that previous existence of what was a dysfunctional relationship. We want to create new relationships. And that's why those who are marginalized would actually speak that language rather than maybe some of the other language that we've been using.
So that leads me to the second part of the question, which is really the practical issue.
Yeah.
How does a person who has power and privilege, and who is usually the one who sets up the beloved community, how do we find ways of ceding that power away from ourselves to those who haven't had the voice, to empower them to lead the conversation? Who's doing that well? That's my question.
That's fantastic. I've got to say, I've been so impressed and encouraged with this community because there is a sharing of the voices here that I oftentimes don't see in other communities. Those are the places that I'm most encouraged by, the sharing of the voices. And I've seen that demonstrated here. Folks are coming together on equal footing. Folks are coming together and actually wanting to hear each other's stories. That's a very positive step going forward. And I would really push that a little further to say, what does it mean to hear everybody's stories within the community? I want to push on the gender issue a little bit as well, because for me, it's not just the race issue, but as I was pointing out with the quadrilateral there, there's also some gender issue. I didn't speak to about the gaze upon the black female, but that's even another layer of complication right there. So that's kind of a double alienation, both in terms of gender and in terms of race for black women. So how are those voices being heard? One of the ways that I speak about, maybe two very practical ways, and I think it's already happening here, is I've spoken at a lot of Christian colleges where the history has been, let's get that one black friend, right? That's the key, that one black friend. Now, I don't disagree with that. I think that's a very positive step forward, to have that cross-cultural relationship. But what has actually shaped my thinking on racial reconciliation is not being the friend of someone different from me, but being the mentee, or to be mentored by someone different from me. And this is true. I don't think it's true here, but this has been my experience at many Christian colleges and many churches especially. Every minority has had dozens of people in authority over them who has been not their race and culture, right? Every minority has that. We've always had white professors. We've always had white denominational leaders. We've always had, most of the time, white political leaders. There's never been a moment in most of our lives where we have not had a person of authority over us, spiritual, political, social, economic, all these authorities. We've always had a white person at one point in our lives over authority over us. I have found that most white Americans cannot point to a single person of color who has had authority over them in some way or another. Whether that's political. In fact, when you have had a person in politically authority over them, you did everything to undermine his authority by saying that he's not an American, that he was born in Kenya, and all that sort of stuff. So the idea of being able to submit to a person of color and authority over you is a huge deal. And I would say in the church, that would be my challenge. Have you had a person of color in spiritual authority over you? This has been the most profound experience in my life, that I say that my spiritual formation was in the Korean immigrant church, my ministry formation was in the black church. Ray and Gloria Hammond, who pastor an AME church in Boston, Bishop Brian and Carmen Green, Larry and Virginia Ward, Bill and Paulia Mooney McCoy, Nick and Sheila Rowe. These are all African-American pastors who invested in me as a pastor, invested in my wife and I. My wife and I say, without the Hammonds, our marriage would not have survived. And so when you're in that place where you are learning as a learner and as a mentee, that actually changes the equation very significantly. So I would ask, where are the places? And tied into that, if you don't have that formal personal relationship, and I think that's what's so wonderful about this gathering, you have that chance. You have that chance to be mutual learners from each other. I would also challenge, who are you reading? What are you reading? What have you surrounded yourself with so that you are in another place where you're not only seeing the dominant perspective? So this is what two things I usually ask at Christian colleges and at universities. If the school, to students, if the school does not give you a diversity of faculty, staff, and the experience of learning from a diverse faculty and staff, you are not getting an education for 2045. You're getting an education that's appropriate for 1965. Because in 2045, everybody is going to be diverse, and if you're not being trained for that now, you're not being trained for the future, you're being trained for 1965, in which case you should go to the bursar's office and say, I want to pay 1965 tuition rates, because you're giving me a 1965 education. So, how are we creating a culture of leadership, of mentorship, of faculty, of staff that actually creates that diversity of those above us who are teaching us? But also, what are we reading? I ask this quite a bit when I look at syllabi. And this is very true in seminary, unfortunately. I see quite often, you have 3 required readings, oftentimes 3 or 4. They're all written by white men. And then in a supplemental reading, you'll get, okay, you can read a book by Cone if you want, if you have to. Or, okay, if you can read a book about Gutierrez, then you have to. But the main reading tends to be by white men, European men. So what does that say about who are the authorities on these topics? And so how do we change that? How do we change the world that we live in? Another thing I've often talked about is, what is that? I have a friend, a white couple, who wanted to do a cross-cultural adoption. They're going to adopt an African-American child. And they make them do training in order to be prepared for that. So they set them at those kind of round tables, and they put all the couples around these round tables, and they're each given a clear glass bowl. And then in the middle of the table are all these different colored marbles. And then they ask a series of questions of what you surround yourself with. Questions like, the last 10 books that you've read, what are the color of the authors? And you fill the bowl with the color of the authors of the last 10 books you've read. The last 5 people you've had over in your home. The last 3 podcasts that you listened to, who were what color were the people who led that or spoke in that podcast? The decor of your house. The artwork around your school, the pictures of the famous people and alumni, all of these things that you surround yourself with helps to form the narrative and imagination of that community. And so my friend, who's a very woke, white pastor on the south side of Chicago, said after all these questions about what he has surrounded his life with, the friendships, the culture, the art, all the things that he said, I had a bowl filled with white marbles. I live on the south side of Chicago. I pastor a multi-ethnic church, but I realize that all the influences in my life are coming from one community. And the final clincher, of course, is to say, take the color marble of the child you're about to adopt and put him in the middle of that bowl. And you've got that one black marble in the middle of a sea of white marbles. That's what's passing for diversity in many of our churches. That's what's passing for diversity in many of our Christian communities. How do we change what we fill our bowl with? How do we learn and are mentored in different ways so that our world feels and seems different and it changes the way we live in that world? Yeah. And then we'll come back up. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I've enjoyed your message.
Thank you.
My name is Larry Todd. I'm the pastor of the New Testament Temple of God Church here in Macon for 3 years. I have a question for you. I talk to some of the millennials quite often, and the question that they had was one of the was in your lecture. And you said that you talked about the dead bodies and the privileged and the powerful. They're asking the question, say, if there remain a standoff between the privileged and the dead bodies, what are the alternatives for the dead bodies?
Well, I think what happens, and this is coming from the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is a phenomenal kind of comprehensive work, I think, because the prophet narrator, Jeremiah, the privileged voice, does speak up every once in a while as a descriptor, as a narrator, but he definitely moves out of the way so that the main voice that comes up are the sick, the hurting, the widows, and the orphans. The most powerful moment, however, is chapter 5. Chapter 5, the last chapter of Lamentations, is the most typical lament you'll see in this book. It kind of uses the standard formula for lament. It is the most prayerful. It's actually the one that, maybe the only chapter in the book of Lamentations that directly addresses God as a prayer. But what happens by chapter 5 is that the prophet's voice completely disappears. And by the time you get to chapter 5, the people have been empowered enough that they are now able to speak up. So the goal of people in power and privilege is to come to a place where by chapter 5, the dead voices, the silenced voices can speak up. I didn't do it today. If I had more time, I would have done this. One of the things I do is I go into much more detail about the slave trade. And I'm stunned how few people know about what happened in the slave trade. The horrible, horrible theological justification people try to use to enslave Africans. The horrible actions by the European colonial powers for enslavement. And again, the theological justification for those actions. Those are dead bodies that need to be heard. Right? Those stories need to be heard. And so it's not kind of a morose, morbid sort of thing. It's just the reality. You have to deal with those bodies, and you have to let the previously silenced voices emerge and be heard. Yeah, there's a question up here.
What happens when the silent voices are too afraid by power to speak, but yet when they're within themselves, they scream?
Yeah. I would argue what you're describing in terms of there's more power that kind of comes from those with similar experiences, or kind of an empowerment that occurs. I would say this is a very positive argument for ethnic-specific churches. Now, I was a pastor of a multi-ethnic church for many years, and I'm very committed to multi-ethnic churches. Right now, the number is at about 10% of all churches in the United States are considered integrated churches, diverse churches. That's a really pathetically low number. I don't think we should jump that number from 10 to 100%. I don't think it's fair to do that. I don't think it's right to do that, mainly because of what you're describing. That for me as an Asian American and a Korean American, I needed the formation, the spiritual formation within the Korean immigrant church so that I can find my voice. The Korean church helped me find my voice, and then the black church helped me find my voice. So without that experience, I might not be doing what I am today, because I had an empowerment that occurred in the context of the Korean church that I might not have got in another context. I saw this with my kids. We wanted our kids to be in more diverse environments. Our daughter went to a youth group where she was the only person of color in that youth group, and I saw her confidence crumble because she was alienated because she was different from everybody else. So we put her into a different youth group where she was not the only person of color, and that empowered her. So I would argue that we don't need to have every church be multi-ethnic. We need more, 10% is a low number, but we do need places and spaces where that empowerment can occur, safe spaces where that can occur. I see this as a very personal thing for story of my family, where my mom is now in her 80s, and she worked really hard. I shared some of the story last night. We grew up in a kind of a rough neighborhood, and my mom worked very hard to get us out of the hood. She worked hard all of her life, but at the same time, I don't feel the need, even though I'm committed to multi-ethnic ministry, to impose that on my 85-year-old mother. For one, she's kind of struggling with early stages of Alzheimer's, and so kind of any new thing is going to be difficult for her to learn. And what's familiar, being in a Korean church, is really what she needs as a senior citizen, also with Alzheimer's. So I'm not going to impose that on her, because her empowerment, her sense of self and identity, almost requires for her to be in an ethnic-specific church at this stage in her life. Now, for me and my family, my wife and our kids, we will always be in multi-ethnic churches. But that doesn't mean that space where the African-American community, the Korean immigrant community, the Spanish-speaking immigrant community, some of these spaces are necessary so that these empowered voices can now speak to the larger community.
Yes. All right.
I'll be around for a little bit as well. Yeah.
Dr. Rah, could you expound on the, I guess, the quadrilateral gaze of the African-American woman?
Yeah, so the gaze of the white male upon the African-American, I didn't have this on the screen, but I'm drawing that from the work of Bell Hooks, who said that the two categories that are oftentimes used of the white male gaze and the black woman is the mammy and the Jezebel. And Hooks notices that black women are portrayed as the mammy, and some of this goes back to kind of plantation life. You saw this in like 12 Years a Slave, where you saw, kind of the mammy who takes care of the family, who's the maid, the cook. In fact, the three Oscar winners, black women who've won Oscars, the first black woman who won an Oscar was Butterfly McQueen, who literally played the mammy. She was the large black woman who take care of the kids on Gone with the Wind, right? That's her character. And then the second black woman to win an Oscar was Halle Berry, who played a Jezebel character, who was sexually involved with a white man. And then Lupita's character was also, was not herself, but the way that the white master looked at her was as a sexualized object, as a Jezebel. And so what we're seeing then is, again, kind of the dominant culture identifying that person based upon the dominant cultural perspective and not allowing that person to form their own identity. The modern equivalent, and this is not them, but this is the way society views them, would be the Oprah and the Beyonce, right? And the way society looks at Oprah as the large black woman who gives away cars and trips to Australia, versus Beyonce, who is always seen as a hypersexualized individual. Even though that's not what they're doing, that is the way society categorizes them. So that creates a dysfunction in terms of these categories and the way we relate. I would say the other factor that I didn't tap into that I would want to push a little more on is that bottom of the white male and the white female and the black female. I think that's where some of the most profound racial reconciliation work can occur. And it's just kind of instinctual on my part that I know of that the conversations that I've had the chance to hear within women of color about racial reconciliation, for a number of ways, I've heard that to be much more profound and deeper than I've heard among men. And so because there's both are disenfranchised in different ways, does that open the conversation a little bit more? So I think white women and women of color, black women, Asian women, Latino women, I think that's a conversation that maybe we need to kind of hear a little bit more about and from. Yeah.
Again, I have to thank you so profoundly for awakening us, all of us, to our shortcomings and our lack of courage to do that which we've been called to do.
Mm.
You spoke of lamentation. It seems to me that I think there's a segment of the Christian faith that is allergic to the concept of lamentation.
That's right. That's right.
And uses every trick in the book.
Yes.
Obama is truly and truly a Kenyan, in order to deal with the pain of reconciliation.
Yeah.
Slavery happened a long time ago.
Right, so we don't need to lament it anymore.
Get over it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we can go on and on and on.
Yeah, yeah.
My metaphor, the thing that sums it all up, the depth of our distress, is the hour of 11 to noon on Sunday.
Yeah.
Somebody has referred to it as the most segregated.
That's right.
I insist that it is the most unholy hour of the week. How do we overcome that?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely movement towards kind of greater diversity in churches. And I mentioned that in 1996, we started only the second integrated church in Boston. This is 1996. This isn't 1896. It took us in 1996. So what we're talking about is that we have a long history of segregation. And I think we do need much more intentional integration. But as I said earlier, I don't think it's simply forcing churches to come together. In fact, the statistics are showing that when you merge churches together, within a year, they're going to separate again, because we have to be ready for this kind of integration. That's where so much of my hope is in the next generation. As I said, our kids are growing up in a naturally multi-ethnic environment because they're going to school. Hopefully, they're going to schools in integrated communities. They're attending colleges in integrated communities. Their reading list and their exposure to history is much broader than what has previously been. So that's why I'm really a strong component of a healthy, robust education for our kids. And that's why I'm a little nervous about the ways that we control the curriculum and put kind of a American patriotic value system that, that's not really teaching, it's actually brainwashing, essentially. So if we are doing a type of curriculum that engages the larger narrative of American society, understanding the depth of what's happened with the slave trade, understanding the depth of what happened with the Native American. Now, my current book right now is on the Native American story, and there's so much we don't know about the Native American story. It's kind of a big vacuum in our history right now, and that's one of the things I'm working on right now. If we were to do that, would that change what that next generation begins to do? And I think the older generation will encourage that. I don't know if that's going to be possible to have all the baby boomer churches become multi-ethnic, but I think we'll see more millennial churches and Gen X churches be multi-ethnic, and I'm hoping that that will actually kind of be leading the way going forward.
All right, so Betty has impressed on me. We have a black female who's not had a chance to ask
All right,
questions.
let's go for it.
How can we do this?
We're going to give voice.
Betty's going to ask a quick question, and then Pastor Clifford Little. Oh, there you okay, Cliff. If you'll come and do the benediction. No. If you'll come and do the benediction after this question. Thank you.
I would like to ask you a question. Everything seems to revolve around churches. As individuals, we as individuals, for many who will never pick up a book to read, how would you suggest that we start to seriously work on race relations and reconciliation? And starting in our homes, and you mentioned about the schools, which is a good start.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned this a little bit last night, that sometimes the imagination and the narratives that are out there are much more powerful than reality, right? And because the media and our politicians weave a particular story, and many of us are not good consumers. We will buy into what's being sold, and we won't take the time to actually process that. This is where I hope the church, instead of amplifying and being an echo chamber for the narrative that is out there, to be a counter narrative. And it doesn't have to be everybody has to read my book, although that would be great. If you want to do that, that's fine with me. But it's more, how are we preaching? How are we living life so that it demonstrates an alternative narrative? So there's an educational discipline called systems thinking that came out of the business community many years ago. And systems thinking says that there's usually a momentum going in one direction within a system. Now, that could be a positive momentum or a negative momentum. I would say right now we're dealing with a negative momentum, anti-immigration bias, anti-people of color bias. That momentum seems to be gaining. It is very hard to get within that system to stop that system, right? So those who get sucked up into that system will more likely be shaped by that dysfunctional system than changing that system. It's that old movie with Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's more likely that you will become corrupted by the system than actually change the system. I can't think of greater evidence than what we've seen in the last year of how that system has become corrupted, where good people are actually getting eaten up by the system and saying things they never would have said 2 years ago, and now many of them are leaving the system because they're realizing how corrupt that system is. Do we go from within the power to perpetuate that, to fight it, or do we create an alternative system that is a slowing action for that negative system, right? So you've got this negative momentum going. You try to get into that system to change it, kind of fight against it, you're probably going to get caught up in that hamster wheel and keep going in that same direction. Unless you create an alternative system that moves in a counter direction. So that if momentum is going this way, you create a system going this way. When that systems interact, then it slows down this movement by having a counter movement. That's the church. That's the church. We are providing a counter narrative. We are showing a beloved community. We are speaking truth in love. We are not on the inside keeping up the system and keeping the system going. We are creating new communities, new culture, new system that says that is a corrupt system. We still have to live there, but we're going to create a system that's actually going to generate new momentum in another direction. And unfortunately, the church has actually been more a part of the dysfunctional system rather than creating healthy systems in response.
Wow, very good. Brother Cliff, come. Let me remind you that immediately following this session, we will break up into small groups and have some small group conversations. So we hope that many of you will be able to stay for that. And then after that, there will be lunch. So, Brother Cliff.
Come on, let's give the Lord a praise for what we have just heard. Come on, come on. Great, great, great. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something, because as we leave this place, I think we must do something. And by the way, it came down to the church. The church. And so I'm going to ask you to do something. It's not anything that's hard, but it's something that we need to do. I'm going to ask you to reach out toward your neighbor, somebody that's close to you. Everybody should have a neighbor. If you don't have one, find one. Reach out and grab somebody by the hand. Each person has one. Each person, just find one person. One person. Don't try to grab two. No, not two. Just grab one person. Each person grab one person. Hold them by the hand. Each person find one person. Now, Mike McClendon got two. I know all y'all want McClendon, but he's already been claimed, so my brother here got to find, well, okay. Sometimes you have to let it be, right? God is good, isn't he? And what I'm going to ask you to do now is to, that free hand, lift it up toward heaven as we pray for and speak God's benediction upon his people. Father, we do thank you for what our ears have heard and our hearts have received, and we pray now your blessings upon these thine people. God, bless us to love you with the love of God, that agape love that you loved us with. Bless us to love you with that love, and to also love our brother or our sister whose hands we are holding, that we love one another with the agape love of God. And bless us, oh God, to go out into this world that belongs to you and cause it to be the kind of world that you would have it to be. Bless us to form the beloved community which Jesus told us about and Dr. King preached about. We thank you now. Bless us to go out and change Macon and the world. In Jesus' name. All of God's people said amen, amen, and amen. God bless you. Let's go make a difference.